We've just posted my review of this Thermaltake CTE C750 Air PC case on Kit Guru, and my next review is of this, the ECS Liva 1 Mini PC, supports Intel LGA 1700. And why am I showing you this Thermaltake? Because this mini PC is so tiny, it's actually inside the Thermaltake. The ECS is so tiny, it fits literally in the palm of my hand. The Liva 1 H610 is a mini PC. It's a bare bones. Easy to get inside, single thumb screw at the rear. Slide off the top cover, which is fairly well ventilated. And there we have it. The LGA 1700 processor socket supports 12th gen Alder Lake and 13th gen Raptor Lake. We have two DDR4 SODIMMs memory slots. When you're considering a bare bones, you need to think about the cost of components. 16GB 2x8GB of DDR4 3200 SODIMMs cost me £35 from Amazon. I consider that to be a bargain. You'll also need storage. We have one M.2 slot next to the M.2, which is for the Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 802.11ax. You can get a 500GB decent SSD for £50. You can get a budget drive even cheaper. Obviously you can get terabyte in there, no difficulty. If you're on a really tight budget, a 250GB M.2 SSD is worth considering. And also we have a caddy for a SATA SSD. They are about £10 cheaper than M.2. So heaps of storage at minimal cost. This is really good news. The processor, this is where things get slightly more expensive. I have here an Intel Core i3-12300, which I cannot currently find on sale, which is slightly bizarre. You can find the 12100 without difficulty. The snag is that models such as this Core i5-13500 aren't really compatible with this mini PC. It supports up to 65 watt processors. However, the boost power of many processors goes significantly beyond 65 watts. And the problem there is the power supply that comes with this mini PC is rated at 120 watt. So clearly, if the boost power of the processor wants to go beyond that, that's not going to be so good. And then we have the VRMs. They are 6 phases, look to be arranged in a 4+1+1 configuration, 4 for the processor, 1 for the IGP, 1 for the SoC. We are of course using integrated graphics, so you need the graphics that are in your processor, so don't even think about saving money by buying a Core i5-12400F, for example, without graphics core, because then you don't have a PC. You need a processor that has graphics. The VRMs are rather obscure. They're a type we haven't seen before. They're Dr. Moss from Nico Semiconductor, and depending on which spec you look at, they seem to be rated at either 25 watts apiece or 40 watts apiece, which rather suggests that the 4 phases for the CPU might actually end up working rather hard relative to their 100% load capability. In the package we also have this cooler, which is a 2-part assembly. So that cooler goes on the VRMs and the processor. We have thermal pads in place, peel off the tape, put it in place, and then you add the blower type cooler, which clearly looks like it's designed for a laptop but has mounts that are suitable for this setup. A few other bits and pieces in the package, but not many. We have a base mount, so we can peel off that little piece of tape to reveal a female thread. Then we can stand the PC vertically like so, and it is the tiniest PC in the world. Alternatively, we can use this Visa mount. You install 2 supplied screws in the rear of the case, attach the Visa mount to the rear of a suitable monitor, slide the PC into place, et voila, the mini PC is now mounted on the back of a monitor. When I say suitable monitor, you need to be able to see the 4 Visa screw mounts on the back of the monitor, so you can install this plate. Because the plate has to be installed and then the PC drops into position. If you can't see the screw holes, it's no good. So if your monitor has any form of pivot mount, it's probably not going to be suitable. Funnily enough, a more basic monitor is typically better than a sophisticated monitor. But hey ho, that saves money. When we look at the ports and connectors, on the front of the chassis we have two USB 3.2 Gen 1x1 Type A ports and two USB 3.2 Gen 2x1 Type C ports. There's also a combo audio jack and a mic in jack, plus a power button. On the rear panel, Kensington lock, power in, two DisplayPort 1.4s, one HDMI 2.0, a VGA port, which is a real throwback. This PC supports a maximum of 3 outputs, so very likely the VGA will go unused. We have 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, two USB 3.2 Gen 1x1 Type A's, and two USB 2.0 Type A's. The bare bones itself costs £250 euros dollars. In addition, you're going to need memory, a processor and storage, plus a copy of Windows. Overall, you're looking at £500 would be an entry-level build, and I don't see much point in going much further than that, but clearly if you max out memory, max out storage, you might get to, what, £600 to £700. So let's put a PC inside the ECS Liva 1 H610. Tool-free SSD installation. We pull out this little plastic pin. Never seen that before. Very neat. I've installed 4 screws with these large heads in the side of the SSD. Do I put the connector on first or do I do it? Oh, let's do it after. So perhaps putting the connector on first would have been the smarter move. Cooler. I've removed the tape from the thermal pads that go on the VRMs. And now the blower fan, and that connector goes there. On with the top cover. There we go, less than 5 minutes. The BIOS is very basic. Here in simple mode we see a listing of the hardware. So that's the name of the PC, there's the BIOS date, doesn't even give you a BIOS version, just a date, processor, memory, and some information about voltages and speeds, and I suspect most of this information will be pretty much irrelevant to the average user of this type of PC. We go to advanced mode. It's not really that advanced. This is similar to the BIOS in a business laptop. Let's look at power management, see what options we have. Very few. Chipset. Okay, we can pretty much ignore everything here. What's tweak? Tweak, overclocking. Yeah, okay. Given you've got a 65 watt power limit on the processor and 120 watts absolute limit on the power supply, realistically, I think we can ignore this. In theory, supports overclocking. In practice, not so much. Memory frequency. Oh yes, 2400 megahertz rather than 3200 megahertz. I'd better explain that. When I first started up the ECS Liva 1 H610, I had fan spin, but I had no display. I figured out it was down to the memory, so I've swapped out the crucial memory I've originally shown you for this Corsair Vengeance 2400. Cost the same as the 3200 Crucial, about £35 from Amazon, and most importantly of all, it works. However, this gives us an opportunity to look again at the CPU cooler, which, as I mentioned, is in two parts. You can use just the main part of the cooler on its own if you're running a 35 watt processor. However, if you're using a 65 watt processor, you add the blower fan. The two-part nature makes it easy to install, but the fact if you're using a low power processor you can go passive and silent, I like that. Let's, for the fun of it, run a quick benchmark. Cinebench 23. So we have our Core i3 12300 quad-core processor, all 4 cores running at a little bit over 4 gigahertz. Call it 4.2 gigahertz for round money. 95 watts. So obviously we're in the boost phase. Temperature 68. Let's have a little listen. You can hear the cooler ramping up. When did we last watch a quad-core processor in Cinebench? Now we've dropped back to 65 watts, clock speed's 3.5 gigahertz, and the temperature for the package 62 Celsius. Temperature in this room is 18.5, clearly audible. Nice and cool. 7,403 points. Not awful, but clearly not great. The integrated graphics in our Core i3 processor, Intel UHD 730. They're competent, but they're not really up to gaming. Let's have a quick look, shall we, in Firestrike. Yeah, bit of a slideshow, but I think that's pretty much what we'd expect from this type of graphics. So, not intended for gamers. Well, there we go. A low score for the graphics, a fairly decent score for the processor. Overall, hopeless. We're using very slow DDR4, so let's just see what the impact is on a benchmark. The answer is very far from great, but not actually as bad as I expected. So in a sense, welcome news. Before we get to my conclusions about this ECS Liva 1 H610, I think we actually need to address who it is intended for. What is the intended market? One clear market is businesses who want small PCs, particularly if they're on Visa mounts. They can go on the back of a monitor to give you a kind of PC take on an iMac. Relatively budget PCs that are small, and they certainly don't need much in the way of graphics. I'm sure there are plenty of businesses like that in the UK. I wouldn't be shocked to find the NHS buys thousands, tens of thousands of PCs just like that. But you have to think, don't you? The world's obviously moved to laptops years ago and is moving further towards portable devices, smartphones in particular, iPads. So I have to question who is the market for this PC. And the funny thing is, at least in part, I am part of the market. Various members of my family have PCs that I've built for them because, of course, I've got various parts, as you might imagine, so it's a relatively cheap thing to do. If they were to pay full retail price, I'm quite sure they wouldn't have gone down the PC route. They'd have gone laptop, phone or iPad. But yes, I might be the intended market. So taking me as an example, I've had to buy not one but 2 sets of DDR4 SODIMMs for this ECS, one of which is on its way back because it appears to be faulty. And as an extra point of annoyance, the power cord that comes with this particular PC has a European plug on it. Now I'm trusting if you buy it in the UK you'll get a correct power cord. However, I had to borrow this power cord from my Lenovo laptop with the slightly peculiar Mickey Mouse cloverleaf type plug arrangement. So I have had to work slightly harder than I expected to assemble this PC. But if you don't happen to have processors, SSDs, power cords, SODIMMs lying around, I think you'll find life even slightly more difficult than I found it. So having put those cards on the table, let's move on to the pros and cons. Pros, the good points. Tiny form factor, obviously so, impressively so. It has a good selection of I/O ports and connectors. I must confess I did not expect to have that much connectivity on such a small PC, and I find that deeply impressive. Low power draw. Power costs a fortune at the moment, and it's only going to get worse in my opinion. So a 120 watt power supply, I mean that's a fraction of most PCs, and that is welcome. You've got support for Intel 12th and 13th gen CPUs up to 65 watts, nominal 65 watts. That's quite a range of processors, and we do have Raptor Lake refresh expected later this year, although I don't think that's going to play any part in small form factor low power processors. But there are a decent number of processors on the market you can get that cost around the £100 mark. And finally, and I'm putting this down as a pro, the BIOS is very limited. It's, as I said in the video, it's much like a business laptop, and therefore setup is simple. Now, some people regard a simple BIOS as a problem. I don't. As far as I'm concerned, you want to get the thing up and running and get on with it. The sort of person I think who will use a PC like this, they're not going to go in the BIOS in the slightest, other than to set the clock and maybe the boot device. So a simple BIOS is a good thing. Cons, the negative points. The choice of components is limited by the 120 watt overall power limit and the 65 watt processor limit. In other words, the choice of processors, you're in the Core i3 territory, possibly a low power Core i5. The cooling fan gets noisy under load. It's not horrible, but the blower is only about yay in height, therefore it's a nozzle. So when you ramp up the processor, you can hear it. The Wi-Fi has no antenna. Even though it's quite high-spec Wi-Fi, relatively, the connection speed isn't brilliant. It tops out at 10 megabytes per second. I was connected to Steam downloading a game just for the laugh of it. I didn't show it in the video because there was no point. But the connection speed over Wi-Fi is not particularly good. It functions, it's just not great. You'll want to use Ethernet is my opinion. And finally, DDR4 SODIMMs might hold you back, both in choice of buying the memory to build the PC and in terms of memory bandwidth. I showed a benchmark. The bandwidth is not awful, but we are sub desktop memory, and now of course the world has moved to DDR5. So even though we've got 12th and 13th gen processor support, we're running on DDR4. Overall, I'm wavering on my opinion about the final score. I'm 7.5 or 8, depending on whether you care in the slightest about mini PCs like this. Personally, I'm leaning towards 8 and are worth buying, and that comes as a really pleasant surprise.